There's been much said about this subject. We've all heard much about it. Most of us have heard about this subject from one side or the other. That is to say, we've heard about both sides from one side. And so we should all be better informed tonight, because you will be hearing from the best on both sides tonight. I do want to say that in addition to the comments that were made just a few moments ago, that if you brought children here tonight, we love children. In fact, we have a little saying here that crying babies and disruptive children, like good intentions, should be carried out immediately. So just so you'll know that it's appropriate. And mine may be among the first. Our participants tonight are indeed honoring us by their presence. Let me first of all acknowledge a gentleman who is not a participant in this debate, but who nevertheless has come from a long distance to be a part of a seminar tomorrow. I'm not even sure where he's seated right now, Dr. Henry Morris. Dr. Morris, would you stand? There you are. Would you stand just for a moment, please? I know they'll want to welcome you here tonight. Dr. Henry Morris. Dr. Morris is director of the Institute for Creation Research. He's author of over 300 books and research articles on hydraulics, evolution, education, creation, and his PhD from the University of Minnesota in hydraulics, geology, and mathematics. Tonight, we have with us the distinguished Dr. William Mayer, who is chairman of the National Association of Biology Teachers, Committee on Education and Evolutionary Biology, the author of over 300 books, research articles, and reviews in biology and education. So many honors that we could not possibly list them all during this time. His PhD from Stanford University in biology. Dr. Mayer, would you stand? Would you welcome, please, Dr. Mayer, William Mayer. Dr. Dwayne Gish, Associate Director of the Institute for Creation Research, honors us with his presence tonight. Collaborated at the Cornell University and University of California with Nobel Prize winners in chemistry and medicine. His PhD from the University of California, Berkeley campus in biochemistry. Dr. Gish, would you stand, please, as we welcome you. Then it is a real honor to have with us tonight a gentleman as moderator who is truly neutral on this subject. I shared with the letter I sent to many of you that I am not neutral, and therefore have chosen not to be the moderator tonight. Dr. Donald Richardson, the U of E faculty, also a distinguished educator in this area with many degrees and much respected in this community. Dr. Donald Richardson, you're right in the middle tonight. None of us envies you, but we all respect you for your courage. Would you stand, please?
The statement to be debated this evening before us is this: the theory of evolution is superior to the theory of special creation as an explanation for the scientific evidence related to origins. In short, evolution versus special creation. Dr. Gish will go first and may speak no longer than 60 minutes. We will then have a very, very brief breather. You may stand, inhale, exhale twice, and then sit down. And then Dr. Mayer will follow, also for no longer than 60 minutes. After Dr. Mayer speaks, we will have a short intermission of 10 minutes, at the end of which we will all return to our places to hear the first rebuttals. The first rebuttal will last no longer than 15 minutes each. The second rebuttal will last no longer than 5 minutes each. I will notify each speaker when he has 5 minutes left of his constructive speech and 5 minutes left of his first rebuttal. I will also notify each speaker when he has 1 minute remaining in his second rebuttal. Following the rebuttals, a question and answer period of no more than 45 minutes will follow. The audience may wish to make personal notes in anticipation of that period. Questions will be directed alternately to each debater. After the question, the other debater may comment, followed by additional comments by the person to whom the question was directed. One of the most important features of this debate is its restriction to scientific evidences alone. Both debaters are specifically requested to refrain from references to the Bible or religion. Are there any questions from either debater? The audience is requested to withhold any public expression of agreement or disagreement during the debate. Please hold your applause until each speaker has finished his presentation. Dr. Gish, you may begin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richardson and Dr. Mayer. Ladies and gentlemen, certainly it's my pleasure to be here this evening and to have this opportunity of presenting to you the nature of the scientific evidence that has convinced me as a scientist that the theory of evolution is scientifically untenable and that the best explanation for our origins is that of direct spatial creation. The late Professor Harlow Shapley of Harvard University said, "Some people piously proclaim, in the beginning, God. I say, in the beginning, hydrogen." You see, one of the more popular theories on the origin of the universe, the so-called Big Bang Theory, tells us that some billions of years ago, all of the energy and matter of the universe was crammed together in some huge cosmic egg. Now, no one has the foggiest notion where that cosmic egg came from or how it got there. Maybe the cosmic chicken laid the cosmic egg. But in any case, here was this cosmic egg, which then exploded. And sometime, a brief time, relatively brief time after this explosion, the only thing that existed in this entire universe was hydrogen gas. And this hydrogen gas had expanded out into the vast stretches of the universe. And it is from that hydrogen gas that the universe has created itself. The stars and galaxies created themselves. Our solar system created itself. Life created itself on this planet. And all living things, including man, finally have arisen, starting with that hydrogen gas. Someone has said, well, if that's true, then one could say that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given sufficient time, becomes people. And of course, that is precisely what evolutionists do believe. This is what Dr. Mayer believes. This is the theory of evolution. Starting with hydrogen gas, then, everything that we have in this universe has created itself. Now, the creation scientist says, no, that is not possible. That is physically impossible, that could have occurred. And furthermore, when we look at the historical record, the fossil record, we find that evidence is highly contradictory to this notion and is much better support for the concept of creation. Now, let me make clear what I mean by creation. Let me try to define in general terms creation. By creation, we are referring to this concept, first of all, that the universe could not have created itself. The universe had to be created supernaturally by something external to it and independent of the natural universe. This creator, whom I call God, and I would just say frankly, I believe it to be the God of the Bible, but that's the end of that. But whatever. You see, science doesn't tell us who the creator is. It doesn't tell us why he created us. It doesn't tell us anything about the relationship of the created to the creator. But the creation scientist said there must be a creator who created this universe, that God created the stars, he created the planets, he created life on this planet Earth, and he created each one of the basic types of plants and animals. We might refer to them as the created kinds. The basic morphological designs, the basic types of each plant and animal were created. They did not arise from a common ancestor by any sort of a mechanistic, naturalistic process. We believe that God used spatial processes which are not in operation today. Therefore, it's referred to as spatial creation. And so this is a basic concept now that which we are here to defend this evening. When did that take place? What about the time? Well, some creationists, both theologians and scientists, believe that the earth is old. Some creationists, both theologians and scientists, believe that the earth is young. So there's a division of opinion on that point among the creationists. But really, we're not here to debate when the universe came into existence, but how. That is a basic question. Now, time, of course, is an important question, but it's not the critically important question, not the question that we are to debate here this evening. Now, we compare or contrast that to evolution, the theory of evolution. Now, there are only really two possible explanations for our being here tonight, ultimately. Either we were created supernaturally, or we evolved naturally by mechanistic, naturalistic processes. Now, there are only those two possibilities. Any idea that you might have on origins can be placed under one of those two umbrellas or basic models of origins. Now, I want to point out there were no human witnesses to the origin of the universe. There were no human witnesses to the origin of life. There were no human witnesses to the origin of a single living thing. These events happened only once, happened in the unobservable past. Neither Dr. Mayer, nor I, nor anyone else has a time machine that can transport that person back in time to see what actually took place. Neither are we able to construct a theory and then go into a laboratory and see if by that suggested process we can generate a universe. It is not possible to see if we can create life by any such supposed theory. It's not possible to go in the laboratory and test any theory to see if by this suggested process a fish will change into an amphibian or an ape into a man. You can't do that. Neither creation nor evolution is a scientific theory because they are trying to reconstruct events that happened in the past. That's history, and that's not science. Creation and evolution are inferences based upon circumstantial evidence. Evolution is not a scientific theory. Creation is not a scientific theory. They are inferences. Now, that does not mean we have no evidence relative to one or the other, but they do not fulfill the criteria of scientific theories, and they are equally religious. If you assume that the universe had a totally mechanistic, naturalistic origin, that is a worldview. That's a philosophy. That is, in essence, a metaphysical idea. It's a religion. And so evolution is just as religious as creation, and creation is just as scientific as evolution. Well, then how can we decide which is more likely to be true? Well, there are some ways of getting an idea. We can, I believe, establish a confidence or a credibility in one or the other. First of all, we can compare each suggestion, evolution or creation with present natural laws and natural processes. Now the evolutionist says that he can go out into the universe, out into the world as it now exists, and by his understanding of the natural laws and natural processes that are now operating, plus nothing, he can explain the origin of everything. Therefore, his theory of evolution must not be contradicted by any natural law or natural process that is now operating in the universe. Secondly, we can take a look at the fossil record. We do have some record of the past. Now, we weren't there. We didn't see actually what happened, but we can attempt to infer what may have happened by looking at the fossil record, the record of life of the past. So we can do these two things. Now, let us do just that this evening. Now, before we do this, however, we must define evolution. But I'm going to let Sir Julian Huxley do that for us this evening. May we have the first slide, please? There's a definition of evolution by Sir Julian Huxley, the famous British biologist and evolutionist. We'll have to turn out some more of these lights, I'm afraid. All right. Huxley said that evolution, in the extended sense, can be defined as a directional and essentially irreversible process occurring in time, which in its course gives rise to an increase of variety and an increasingly high level of organization in its products. Our present knowledge indeed forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation. End of quote. Now, first of all, I want you to note that this evolutionary process is a process of self-transformation. God is not necessary. By definition, God is excluded. This process took place naturally according to properties inherent in matter. It was a process of self-transformation. Notice also that it is a directional process. It has gone from disorder to order, from simple to complex, from primordial chaos to the cosmos. Notice also that it has led to an increasingly high level of organization in its products, always and ever upward. Notice further that it includes everything: the origin of stars, the origin of the galaxies, the origin of our solar system, the origin of life, the origin of all living things, including man, with our 30 trillion cells of over 200 varieties, 12 billion of which are found in our 3-pound human brain, with its 120 trillion connections. All of that is a product of this naturalistic evolutionary process. Our consciousness, our ability to think of the past, to plan for the future, even our faith in God, is nothing more than the product of this evolutionary process. Now, that's the theory. From the primordial cosmic egg and Big Bang to man, all occurred naturally and spontaneously. Now, if that is true, what would we expect to find out there in the real world? Well, certainly, if this has happened, if hydrogen gas has transformed itself into everything in this universe today, which is obviously an incredibly complex, highly ordered, highly structured universe, here on Earth with millions of incredibly complex species, then matter must have an intrinsic ability, an inherent ability to transform itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. That must be a property of matter. That would be nature's way. There would be a universal tendency then for things to go in that direction. We would have a natural law which describes this intrinsic property of matter, if evolution is true. Now, on the other hand, if creation is true, we could assume that God created the universe in a state of perfection. Well, obviously it's not in a state of perfection now. Just wait a minute, it gets worse every minute. But we could assume that that was the case. Now, if God created the universe in a state of perfection, then we would not expect that matter would have an intrinsic ability to promote itself to higher and higher levels of organization. We would not expect that matter would have any intrinsic ability to promote itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. We would not predict or expect to discover such a property of matter. However, if anything has happened since creation to change the original created state, that change could only lead downward. Matter might have an intrinsic tendency to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. Now, that might be a natural property of matter that we would predict and expect on the basis of creation. Now, you see then, on the basis of these two models of origins, we are predicting opposite tendencies. Evolution, simple to complex, disorder to order. Creation, order to disorder, from complex to simple. All right? There are the two predictions. Now let's go out in the real world. Let's take a look. Let's see what's going on out there in this very real world. Well, now let me point out, first of all, that no scientist has ever detected any inherent tendency of matter to promote itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. That is not nature's way. That is not a natural tendency of matter. There is no natural law which defines or suggests such a process. We don't have a natural law of that kind. It's not known in science. But we do have a natural law that describes precisely the opposite tendency. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a universal natural tendency for all observed systems to go from order to disorder, from the complex to the simple. Everything tends to go in that direction. I don't care what kind of a system you're talking about, whether it's a closed system, an isolated system, an open system, whatever kind of a system it is, everything tends to go in that direction. And I'm going to permit Isaac Asimov to state this for us. Now, I had the privilege of debating Isaac Asimov in the pages of Science Digest, October of 1981. And you can, now he's one of our most prolific science writers, and you can bet I quoted this statement by Isaac Asimov in that debate. That's shown on the next slide. May we have the next slide, please? In the Smithsonian Institute Journal, June of 1970, on page 6, we find the following statement by Isaac Asimov. He says, I quote, "Another way of stating the second law," that's the second, let me explain, ladies and gentlemen, what he's talking about is the second law of thermodynamics. This is a law of thermodynamics, a law of science, one of the most well-established laws known in science. That is the natural law that describes this all-pervasive, never-failing tendency. And so Dr. Asimov says, again I'm quoting, "Another way of stating the second law, then, is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again, very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing, and everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about." End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, if that is what the second law of thermodynamics is all about, indeed it seems that evolution is in trouble. Notice this universal natural tendency. Everything goes in that direction, from order to disorder, from complex to simple. That's true of the universe, on the scale of the universe. Galaxies are dispersing. Stars are burning out their fuel. If there is no God, or if God would not choose to intervene, the day will come when this universe is certain to die. Because the time will come, you see, inevitably, when every star in the universe will have exhausted its fuel, and they will all grow cold and dark. All activity, all life will cease. The universe will be dead. That is a certain destiny of this universe, if there is no God. That's where we're headed for. Now, that's true of everything, not only out there in the universe, but our bodies. Our bodies tend to wear out. Our machines, our houses, everything tends to go in that direction. Now, here's my question, ladies and gentlemen. If the natural laws and natural processes that are now governing the universe are leading inexorably to its destruction, and if, as evolutionists believe, these natural laws are all there is and all there ever has been, how then could those very same natural laws have created the universe in the first place? Could the very same natural laws and processes which are now destroying the universe have been responsible for its origin in the first place? What sort of tortured logic would one have to use to reach an illogical conclusion like that? The creation scientist says, no, the universe could not have created itself. The second law of thermodynamics says, no, the universe could not have created itself. Now, one thing certain about this second law of thermodynamics is that it does apply to an isolated system. Now, by an isolated system, we mean a system on which no work is being performed by anything on the outside. It's a system into which nothing is being brought in from the outside. This system is isolated. Everything that takes place within that system is a process of self-transformation. The second law of thermodynamics says that with such a system, never, absolutely never can you ever get an increase of order, complexity, structure, and organization. That will never happen, absolutely never. But inevitably, without fail, with time, that system will become more random, more disorganized, less complex, less highly structured. And yet, evolutionists believe the universe is an isolated system which started in a state of primordial chaos and disorder and transformed itself into the highly ordered, complex, highly structured universe that we have today. A clear violation of the second law of thermodynamics. The evolutionist says he will use and will only use natural laws and processes to explain the origin of the universe. But when his theory is directly contradicted by one of the most well-established natural laws in science, does he abandon his theory? Oh no, not at all. By faith, he believes somehow evolution did it all. But he is going contrary to his very professed belief, you see. Now, we could say much more about thermodynamics. Now, sure, we'll come back to it later. But on the basis of the science of thermodynamics, is no question about it, this universe could not have created itself, and life could never have arisen spontaneously. But let us leave this science of thermodynamics and consider probability laws. Now, there's no question about this universe being incredibly complex. Stars are complex. Galaxies are complex. Our solar system is highly complex. Life is incredibly complex. Even the most primitive form of life is so incredibly complex that if scientists could study that form of life forever, there would still be much about it that they would never understand. It is so complex. How did this happen? How did all of this complexity, this order, this machinery, this purpose, how did that come about? Just by chance, by accident, according to evolutionists. The creation says, no, absolutely not. Take that idea, apply the laws of probability to that notion, take the assumed age of the universe, and you could never get a living cell in those assumed 10 or 20 billion years. On the next slide, please, we see the structure of ribonuclease. This is an enzyme. Now, ladies and gentlemen, our bodies have tens of thousands of these enzymes. They are catalysts that make chemical reactions go very rapidly, which ordinarily would go slowly. Life cannot exist without enzymes. The most primitive cell imaginable would have to have hundreds of different kinds of enzymes. And in addition to these enzymes, it had to have hundreds of different kinds of DNA and RNA molecules, even much more complex than these enzymes. All enzymes are proteins. The building blocks of proteins are amino acids. Now today, in living cells, in living things, there are about 20 different kinds of amino acids. Now here in this enzyme, we see that lysine is number 1, glutamic acid is number 2, then threonine, alanine, lysine, phenylalanine, glutamic acid, arginine, glutamine, on around 124 of these amino acids, 20 different kinds, 124 arranged in that precise order. Now, when those amino acids are arranged in that order, you have ribonuclease, an enzyme that helps you digest the ribonucleic acid that you eat in your food. Now take the same 20 amino acids, arrange them in a different order, 188, and you get human growth hormone. It's not an enzyme, doesn't catalyze any chemical reaction, but it's a hormone that directs some very important activities in your body, determines how tall you are. Now, you take those same 20 amino acids, arrange them in a different order, and you get hemoglobin, the red blood protein that binds oxygen. Why does hemoglobin bind oxygen? Why does ribonuclease catalytically decomposes ribonucleic acid? Why does human growth hormone govern how tall we are? Because of that precise arrangement of those amino acids. Just as we have, for example, a message here in the English language. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we have to agree on the convention, on the nature of the language. That can only be done by human beings. The ink and the paper can't do that. The typewriter can't do that. Only intelligent human beings can do that. But even after we have decided on the convention, a typist must arrange those letters in precise order. And when that is done, then information is conveyed. Instructions on how to proceed may be contained here. Well, here we have this marvelous order, absolutely essential for the activity of these biologically active molecules. How did it happen? The evolution says, just by chance. They just happened somehow to get arranged in that order. Oh, well, after all, we had billions of years. You know, anything happens in billions of years. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of things that won't happen in billions of years, and this is one of them. If you would calculate, now I won't take time to do the mathematics because of the shortness of time, if you would calculate the probability of arranging those amino acids by chance. You see, lysine is only 1 out of 20. You just have 1 out of 20 of getting lysine first. The second one is glutamic acid. The probability of getting the 2 in the right order is 1 over 20 times 1 over 20, 1 out of 400. The probability of getting 3 in the right order is 1 out of 8,000. The probability of getting 4 in the right order is 1 out of 160,000. The probability of getting 100 amino acids in the right order is 1 over 20 multiplied times itself 100 times. That's equal to 1 over 10 multiplied times itself 130 times. That is the probability that by chance you will get precisely that arrangement, just going the first 100 amino acids. One chance out of the number 1 followed by 130 zeros. Well, how big is that number? Well, I'll tell you how big it is. If you jam this entire universe, jam-packed solid with electrons so there's not a cubic inch of space left over, you could get about 10 to the 130th power electrons in the entire universe. That's the number 1 followed by 130 zeros. The same number of different ways that you can arrange those amino acids. Here is the probability now that you will get that molecule by chance. packed the universe, absolutely jam-packed solid with electrons. We put your name on one of those electrons, and we send you out in the universe to find the electron with your name on it. By the time you have found that electron with your name on it, we will have constructed one single molecule of one single protein of 100 amino acids. Well, of course, if it never happened, you could hunt for trillions times trillions times trillions times trillions of years and never find that electron with your name on it. But what if it did happen? What would we have? One single molecule of one single protein. But we need billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of protein molecules, billions of tons each of hundreds and thousands of DNA and RNA molecules, and much more. What would be the probability that all of that would happen by chance? We get all of that biologically active material floating around in the ocean? Absolutely, totally, flatly zero. But even if you had all of that, you still would never get life. The next slide, we see a living cell. Now, all cells have membranes. They're incredibly complex. Then you have energy factories, you have protein factories, you have the genetic material, you have many other elements, and they all must be put together in just one unique fashion for life to exist. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, there is no natural tendency for matter to become organized, for these molecules to get together in systems, in complex biologically active systems. There's no tendency to do that. The tendency is to go in precisely the opposite direction. So you could never, even if you had the ocean full of these molecules, they would never get together and make a living cell. Ladies and gentlemen, the notion that life evolved on this planet is nothing more than 20th century mythology. It's a nature myth that man has invented to explain his origin without God. Next slide, please. Here is a newspaper article that appeared in the Daily Express of London in October of 1981. Or it was August 14th, 1981. We're going to have to, I'm afraid we're going to have to, please turn out these lights up here so the people can see the slide. Here's this article that appeared in the Daily Express of London, August 14th, 1981. Two skeptical scientists put their heads together and reach an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. Who were these two scientists? Sir Fred Hoyle, the famous British astronomer, the most famous astronomer in all of Britain, a man who had been known as a lifelong atheist and an evolutionist. And his friend, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, professor and chairman of the Department of Applied Mathematics and Astronomy, University College, Cardiff, Wales. These two scientists became, he was, by the way, Chandra Wickramasinghe was also an atheist and an evolutionist before he began this study. But these two scientists attempted to calculate the probability of the evolution of life. They made certain assumptions about the minimum requirement for a living cell, and then they calculated the probability of all of this evolving by chance on this planet in 5 billion years. The answer came back, one chance out of the number 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. Well, they said obviously life did not evolve on this planet, but after all, we have 100 billion galaxies. Each galaxy contains 100 billion stars. Let us assume that every star in the universe has a planet like the Earth and that the universe is 20 billion years old. Now let's calculate the probability of life evolving on this planet in those 20 billion years. The answer came back, for all practical purposes, just forget about it. The probability was nil, zero. There's no probability that life could have evolved anywhere in this universe. Therefore, they said, life could not have evolved, therefore it had to be created, therefore there must be a God. Sir Fred Hoyle said that the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, I just tell people, if you want to believe that, that's okay, but don't call it science. No, it is not science. It is mythology. Life could not have evolved, therefore it had to be created. Now, these two scientists are saying this. Now, they don't believe in the Bible. They don't believe in the book of Genesis. All they are saying is this: wherever life exists in this universe, it had to be created. Did they become creationists because of their religion? Absolutely not. They became creationists in spite of their religion, because at that time they were atheists. It was a compelling nature of the scientific evidence that convinced them of the fact of creation. Well, we could go on and on about this, but we must hurry. Let's take a look now at the record of the past, the fossil record. Of course, if evolution is true, our museums would be overflowing with transitional forms. Now in our museums, we have 250,000 different fossil species. Why, thousands, tens of thousands of those would be intermediate forms or transitional forms if evolution is true. If we start with a little single-cell organism 3 billion years ago, and this little thing converted itself into millions of species during hundreds of millions of years of time, why, the number of transitional forms that must have lived and died would be billions times billions times billions. And today our museum should be overflowing with undoubted transitional forms. There would be no doubt about the fact of evolution. It would be right there in front of our eyes. All museum exhibits could just lay out these transitional forms, and we would have them all to see, and we'd all be convinced, if evolution is true. On the other hand, if creation is true, we'd expect an explosive appearance of highly complex forms of life for which we've never found ancestors. We'd expect to find the fossils of each one of the kinds, the created kinds, without any intermediate forms. That is what we predict on the basis of creation. It is totally different than what we'd expect on the basis of evolution. All right, let's go out now. Let's dig up the fossils. Let's study them. Let's classify them and compare the data to the predictions of these two models of origins. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say right off the bat, it's just no contest. The evidence that we have is remarkably in accord with creation, but is contradictory and an embarrassment to evolution. More and more evolutionists are beginning to acknowledge this. They're beginning to acknowledge they have no or little evidence for gradual change in the fossil record. As a matter of fact, some evolutionists are beginning to de-emphasize the importance of the fossil record. Mark Ridley, for example, a British evolutionist, in the journal New Scientist, volume 90, 1981, on page 830, stated that no real evolutionist uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to spatial creation. End of quote. Notice what he said. No real evolutionist would do this. No real evolutionist would even try to use the fossil record as evidence for evolution against spatial creation. But why not? Why wouldn't he? What greater evidence could he have for evolution than all of this beautiful, marvelous fossil record with all those intermediate forms? But Ridley says no real evolutionist would even try to do that, because he knows that evolution is in deep trouble when it comes to the fossil record. David Kitts, professor of geology, University of Oklahoma, an evolutionist, a paleontologist, an expert on the fossil record, a man who does believe in evolution. But in an article published in Evolution, volume 28, 1974, Dr. Kitts was discussing the problems of the gaps, the lack of transitional forms, the relationship of evolutionary theory to paleontology, paleontology being the study of the fossil record. In that article on page 467, Dr. Kitts frankly stated as follows. Next slide, please. Dr. Kitts says, and I quote, "Despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them." End of quote. Notice what he said. Although evolution requires intermediate forms, the fossil record, paleontology, does not provide them. Why then is Dr. Kitts an evolutionist? Well, certainly not because of the fossil record, but rather in spite of the fossil record. Because the most decisive evidence possible is strictly against his theory of evolution. Dr. E.J.H. Corner is a botanist of Cambridge University. He is an evolutionist. And in the book Contemporary Botanical Thought, published in 1961, Dr. Corner had a chapter called Evolution, talking about the evolution of plants. On page 97 of that chapter, we see the following statement shown in the next slide. Dr. Corner says, and I quote, "Much evidence can be adduced in favor of the theory of evolution from biology, biogeography, and paleontology. But I still think that to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of spatial creation." End of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, are you unprejudiced? If you are, then according to Dr. Corner, this evolutionist, this botanist, you would have to admit that the fossil record of plants doesn't favor evolution at all. It favors creation. Why did Dr. Corner say that? Well, in the next slide, we get some idea. Here in the next slide, we see an exhibit in the Chicago Museum of Natural History. You probably can't see that slide too well, but it shows major plant kinds. They all lead back to what? What the exhibit says are unknown ancestors. Unknown ancestors. You see, they've never found ancestors for those plants. They just suddenly appear in the fossil record fully formed. And that's true of the major plant kind, ladies and gentlemen. We do not have ancestors or transitional forms for these major plant kind. Now, a friend of mine visited London a few years ago, and he picked up a book called Evolution, written by Dr. Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History. Dr. Patterson invited comments from the readers. So my friend wrote to Dr. Patterson, and he said, "Dr. Patterson, I enjoyed your book very much. But," he said, "it would have been helpful if, in your book, you had supplied examples of actual transitional forms. At the very least, perhaps you could have had an artist illustrate what you think these things look like." Dr. Patterson, in a letter dated the 10th of April, 1979, wrote to my friend, thanked him for the letter, and then he made the following statement shown on the next slide. Dr. Patterson says, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be asked to visualize such transformations, but where would he get the information from? And if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader?" End of quote. Indeed it would. But notice what Dr. Patterson said. Here's a paleontologist, an expert in the fossil record, sitting among one of the greatest collection of fossils in the world. And he says, "You're right. I don't have any examples of transitional forms in my book, but if I had known of any, I certainly would have included them." Now that is just about as plain as anyone can state the true situation. That man is an evolutionist. He certainly would have provided examples if he knew of any. But as he said, he knew of none. Patterson participated in a radio program in England with several evolutionists. It was broadcast over the British Broadcasting Corporation radio, and excerpts appeared in The Listener, 8th of October, 1981. That's a publication of BBC. In that article, Patterson said that all we have of these evolutionary trees are the tips of the branches. All the rest is just simply storytelling of one kind or another. He says that people who say they know how all of this happened, he says that's just empty rhetoric. The man has become somewhat disillusioned with evolution theory. Now listen to what he said. Listen very carefully. He said that when he accepted evolution, he had moved from science into faith. He had moved from science into faith when he accepted evolutionary theory. Let me assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that is precisely what every evolutionist in this world has done. He says he is basing his claims and his theory on science. When a biologist, a geologist, a physiologist starts speculating about origins, he's left his science, and he's telling stories of one kind or another. And Dr. Patterson has said much more that is highly significant. But let's continue. In the next slide, we see the kind of animals, that is the reconstruction of the kinds of animals that are found in Cambrian rocks. Now, evolutionists believe that Cambrian rocks began to form 600 million years ago. They form very slowly and gradually as sediment. A fraction of an inch per year settled out and accumulated, and somehow these animals were trapped and became fossil. Now, I just have to say, ladies and gentlemen, I just don't have the foggiest notion how an animal becomes a fossil under these conditions. You know, when an animal just dies and lies around on the ground or floats around in the water, everything is gone. Shells, bones, teeth, everything disappears. Oxidation, bacterial decomposition, chemical action, all of this destroys it. To get a fossil, that creature has to be buried, and have to be buried rapidly. And we have just massive fossil graveyards of billions and billions of creatures. Well, seems to me that must have required a catastrophe or catastrophes on a massive scale. But regardless of how these things formed or when they formed, here we have their fossils, these Cambrian rocks. And we see that the sea urchins, the trilobites, the jellyfish, sponges, the swimming crustacean Sydnea, brachiopods, worms, sea lilies, a great variety of highly complex creatures are found in these Cambrian rocks, so-called Cambrian rocks. Now, these creatures are so complex, evolutionists believe their origin must have required 2 to 3 billion years. Now, if that's true, then underneath, in the so-called pre-Cambrian rocks, we must find the evolutionary ancestors of these creatures. Now, the pre-Cambrian rocks supposedly were laid down in the tens and hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian rocks. Many of these pre-Cambrian rocks are undisturbed, perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. What do we find in those pre-Cambrian rocks? Well, I'll tell you what we don't find. Nowhere on the face of this earth have we ever found an ancestor for a single one of those creatures. Right from the start, a jellyfish is a jellyfish, a sea urchin is a sea urchin, a sponge is a sponge, and a worm is a worm. Wherever you find them, whenever they occur, they are fully formed. Supposedly they evolved from a little microscopic, soft-bodied creature. Absolutely no transitional form. Now, they report many fossils of little microscopic, soft-bodied, single-celled bacteria and algae. Now look, if we can find fossils of those little microscopic, soft-bodied bacteria and algae, we could certainly find fossils of everything in between those creatures and these creatures. If those hundreds of millions of years of evolution has occurred, nothing like that has been found. These things suddenly appear fully formed. That is the major mystery of the history of life, according to George Gaylord Simpson, famous evolutionist. But the creation scientist says, what greater evidence for creation could the rocks give than this explosive appearance of these complex creatures with no ancestors? Now, it is suggested that one of these creatures evolved into fishes. They say it took about 100 million years. Why, can you imagine how many billions times billions of those intermediate forms would have lived and died? Wouldn't you suppose our museums are just overflowing with these transitional forms, showing what evolved into fish? You see, fish, they are vertebrates. They have a backbone, an internal skeleton like you and I. These are invertebrates. Supposedly one of these things evolved into fishes. 100 million years of evolution, and not one single transitional form has ever been found. Gerald Todd, an evolutionist at UCLA, in an article published in American Zoologist, Volume 20, 1980, said, and I quote, all 3 subdivisions of the bony fishes first appear in the fossil record at approximately the same time. They are already widely divergent morphologically, and they are heavily armored. Let me pause here to emphasize what Dr. Todd has said. Three major kinds of bony fishes appear in the fossil record essentially simultaneously. They are complete when we first see them. They are very different from one another, and they have bony armor plates. Then he goes on to ask the following question. How did they originate? What allowed them to diverge so widely? How did they all come to have heavy armor? And why is there no trace of earlier intermediate forms? End of quote. Why, Dr. Todd says, is there not even a trace of any earlier intermediate form? Why indeed? Why, ladies and gentlemen, every major kind of fish that we know anything about has had its origins firmly based in nothing. They appear suddenly fully formed, and that is precisely, positively, the evidence predicted on the basis of creation, but is an impossibility if evolution is true. Now, next slide, we see the fish that supposedly was the ancestor of amphibians. In the lower portion of the slide, we see what is supposed to be the world's oldest known amphibian. Now, they suggest that fish was the ancestor because it had bones in its fins, which they believe could have transformed itself into the feet and legs of the amphibian. There's a similarity in the vertebrae and some similarities in the pattern of bones in the skull. And that's supposed to show that fish was the ancestor of the amphibian. Notice, ladies and gentlemen, the fish was the fish, 100% marvelously designed for life in the water with a lovely set of fish fins. What do you see in that amphibian? The basic amphibian limb, feet and legs. And in spite of the assumed 30 million years of evolution, they've never found a single intermediate form showing fins changing into feet and legs. Next slide, please. Here's an exhibit in Chicago Museum of Natural History of the suggested evolution of amphibians from fishes. On the right, you see the fish. On the left, you see the amphibian. And in between, you see a remarkable transitional form, half fish and half amphibian. However, the suggested transitional form is labeled inferred intermediate. Inferred indeed. It's strictly imaginary. No one has ever found such a transitional form. Next slide, please. Quickly, the dinosaurs. This is a Triceratops dinosaur with 3 horns on the face, a huge armor plate. Next slide. The Stegosaurus. No horns on the head, but 4 spikes on the tail and those unusual plates along the back. Next slide. We see these spikes about 3 feet long, and those plates, very unique, substantial structures. Suddenly, Stegosaurus, Triceratops appear fully formed with no intermediate form. Next slide. And the duck-billed dinosaurs. Here's Trachodon standing 18 feet high. Many different kinds of duck-billed dinosaurs with those strange duck bills. According to evolutionary theory, jaws and teeth slowly and gradually in millions of years change into a duck bill. Well, I do declare, I don't know where that slide came from. I didn't intend to show that, ladies and gentlemen. It's a picture of my grandson. Next slide, please. Here we see a Diplodocus, this huge plant-eating dinosaur, 100 feet long. And the next slide. And the Brontosaurus, 40 tons, 80 feet long. And the next slide, the largest dinosaur of all, the Brachiosaurus, weighing up to 80 tons, 160,000 pounds. Standing as high as a 5-story building, and with the nostrils not out on the end of the snout, but in a bony dome on the top of the head. We have never found any transitional forms for these dinosaurs. Every one of these dinosaurs have appeared uniquely, suddenly, fully formed, just as we would expect if they had been created. Next slide. Quickly, we want to take a look at human origin. Here is the skull of a creature scientifically known as Australopithecus. First discovered in 1924. This skull was discovered by Dr. Louis Leakey in East Africa in 1959. Donald Johanson has recently discovered a series of creatures that he has called Australopithecus afarensis. One is a female, about 40% complete. He calls it Lucy, and Johanson became famous for his discovery of Lucy. Now, you look at the skull, you can see it's grossly ape-like with a sagittal crest, no forehead, huge eyebrow ridges, huge jaws and teeth, very typically ape. But nevertheless, it's claimed that these creatures walked upright. Donald Johanson says that his Lucy is essentially ape from the neck up. Nevertheless, she walked upright. And therefore, you see, you have a transitional form, an intermediate type. And that is the consensus. That is what is taught in our textbooks, what you see in National Geographic, what you see on television. But there are some scientists who are evolutionists who do not accept this analysis of the evidence. Lord Zuckerman, very famous British anatomist. Dr. Charles Oxnard, now professor of anatomy and physiology, anthropology at University of Southern California. These two scientists are evolutionists. They've studied these creatures for many, many years. They've Lucy. Therefore, if anything, they should be more man-like. But they say these creatures did not walk upright. They are not intermediate between ape and man. Now, that is the central figure in human evolutionary schemes, and yet we find that that creature is under attack by evolutionists themselves. How can that be? Could all of these evolutionists be wrong? Well, they've been wrong in the past. The next slide, we see the famous Piltdown man. Oh, I'm sorry, the statement from Lord Zuckerman. Lord Zuckerman, what he says in this statement, I'll summarize it very quickly. What Lord Zuckerman said in the book published in 1970, Beyond the Ivory Tower, Lord Zuckerman says that if we exclude the possibility of creation, obviously then man must have evolved from an ape-like creature. But if he did, there's absolutely no evidence for it in the fossil record. Now that is the considered judgment of a scientist, an evolutionist, who has searched for many years for man's fossil ancestry. Now the next slide. The famous Piltdown man, reconstructed from a few fragments of a jaw and a few fragments of a skull, suggested as our human ancestor, our subhuman ancestor, for 50 years, until it was proven to be a hoax. Someone had taken a jawbone of an ape, a human skull, had treated them chemically to make them look old, had filed the teeth to make them look man-like, planted them in a gravel pit, and fooled the world's greatest authorities. Because this is what they were looking for. This is what they had expected. Now, 1922, a single tooth. The single tooth was discovered in western Nebraska, brought to the attention of several of the world's leading authorities, and they were very excited by the discovery of this tooth. It seemed to have a number of characteristics that they would associate with man, or a primitive transition form between ape and man. They called this creature, or he became known as Nebraska man. Now, based upon the descriptions of this creature by the scientists, the Illustrated London News had their artist draw a picture of this Nebraska man. This was published in the Illustrated London News in 1922. We see that on the next slide. All right, here on this slide, we see the picture of Nebraska man, the picture of his wife, the picture of the tools that they were using, all based upon that one single tooth. Isn't science a fascinating subject? Well, a few years later, they found some additional remains of this creature, and ladies and gentlemen, he turned out to be neither a man-like ape nor an ape-like man. He turned out to be a pig. That's right, it was a pig's tooth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to look carefully at that picture. That was the evidence for your ancestry back in the 1920s based upon a pig's tooth. What is the lesson? Well, if you look hard enough, if you believe it hard enough, you can see something that really isn't there, you see. And so, if you can get something like this from a pig's tooth, surely you could get something like that from a fragment of an ape or a monkey. Next slide. Finally, the Neanderthal man. Here's the older version of Neanderthal man. He was portrayed as this lumbering, long-armed, knuckle-dragging, beetle-browed, stoop-shouldered, bow-legged subhuman. For nearly a century, this was a picture of Neanderthal man that we were given, our subhuman ancestor. It turned out that he was fully human. These creatures, all of them, suffered severely from rickets, a vitamin D deficiency, which causes the bones to become soft and deformed. The skeleton on which they'd based Neanderthal man was an arthritic old man. The only reason he couldn't walk upright, he had a bad case of arthritis. They finally decided all these so-called primitive features were due to pathological conditions. And he has been upgraded to Homo sapiens, fully human, just like you and I. As a matter of fact, about 20 years ago, a couple of scientists published an article in which they said, well, now really, just take Neanderthal man, give him a shave and a haircut and a bath, put him in a business suit, place him on the New York subway, no one would take a second look. Well, that was 20 years ago. Today, you wouldn't have to give him a shave or a haircut. And in some circles in San Diego, you wouldn't even have to give him a bath. Well, Neanderthal man was not our ancestor, he was human. Nebraska man was not our ancestor, he was a pig. The Piltdown man was not our ancestor, he was a combination of ape and man. And Ramapithecus, he's not our ancestor, he turned out to be something very similar to an orangutan. And something is similar, I'm sure, will happen to all of these other suggested creatures. The evidence shows, as far as I can see, man has appeared fully formed on this planet. There is no real evidence, and I would agree with Lord Zuckerman, there is no real evidence that he has evolved from some lower form. Next slide, please. And here's a modern version of Neanderthal man. Next slide. And here's the flying reptile. Supposedly the flight evolved 4 times in flying reptiles, now extinct, birds, flying insects, and bats, or flying mammals. Surely we must have tremendous numbers of transitional forms. Well, ladies and gentlemen, here is this pteranodon with a long toothless beak, a long bony crest, and that long 4th finger supporting a wing spread of 52 feet, longer than the F-4 Phantom jet. Surely if this creature evolved from a non-flying creature, we'd have many, many intermediates. Ladies and gentlemen, we have never found a trace of any such transitional form. These flying reptiles suddenly appear fully formed. The same is true of flying insects. Not a single transitional form between a non-flying and a flying insect. The next slide. Same is true of the bat. The bat is a flying mammal. Supposedly he evolved from a rat or a squirrel-like creature or something like that. Over millions of years of time, we ought to have many transitional forms. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a picture of the world's oldest known bat, supposedly 50 million years old. And what is he? 100% bat. He suddenly appears fully formed, not a trace of an ancestor, not a trace of a transitional form, and essentially no change in that assumed 50 million years of evolution. You see, this is precisely the type of evidence that we positively predict on the basis of creation. How much time? Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, just in a brief summary, let me say this. Based upon known laws of science, we can say the universe could not have created itself. Life could not have arisen spontaneously. Based upon the fossil record, we know that, in fact, they did not. Thank you very much.
And now comes that first of moments when you can participate by rising in place, taking your couple quick breaths, and then quickly sitting down again.
Dr. Richardson, I forgot to introduce the other people up here. Let me just take this over.
Okay, fine.
Go ahead. While you're stretching, I failed to introduce the other people on the platform. To my right, to your left, is David Schwambach, the youth pastor of this church. Just coming up, Reverend David Merwin, the minister of missions to this church in Korea for nearly 20 years. The treasurer of this church and the leading congressional candidate right now in the 8th District, Jim Ludwig. And the senior pastor, of course, I've already mentioned, our Schwambach. Well, Teresa Patchen, I failed to mention also, our minister of music. And thank you, Teresa, for all your work behind the scenes also tonight.
All right, now you may be seated. We will continue our debate this evening by hearing from Dr. Mayer for the next 60 minutes. Dr. Mayer.
I'm delighted to be in Evansville this evening. Dr. Schwanbach is very kind to invite me. He has been very generous and open throughout the entire series of negotiations, for which I'm delighted. Dr. Richardson, thank you for the introduction. Tonight, somehow, I feel like a lion in a den of Daniels. Now, one of the aims of general education is to expose students to a wide variety of ways of knowing. The humanities attempt to explain the world through literature, art, history. The social sciences explicate the human condition by concentrating on economics, political science, sociology, and similar fields. The sciences explain the world by exposing students to the discoveries of biology, chemistry, physics, geology, astronomy, and a wide variety of related disciplines. Mathematics poses a separate problem. In one sense, it's a foreign language. In another, an inescapable part of science, as well as an essential adjunct to both the social sciences and the humanities. Theology views the world from a base of faith and belief, and a general education is designed to acquaint students with these ways of knowing about the human condition and the world in which we live. Now, each discipline has a way of looking at the world and accounting for it. A poet and a scientist do not view the world with the same eyes, nor do they have the same explanations for its events. If we could have the first slide, please. When persons of different training look at the same object, they frequently think of it in an entirely different fashion. That's not the first one, I'm sorry to say. That's the second one. If you could back up one. A poet may look, I don't know which way you're going, but somehow the first slide is a mountain. There we are. Okay. A poet may look at this mountain and sing of purple mountain majesties. A geologist looks at the same mountain and can think of it as an intrusion of granite. A mineralogist may view it as a source of precious metals, a hunter for the game it contains, or a forester for the lumber it provides. Others may see it as an interesting climb, a place for a vacation, a source of cooler climate, or a wall that blocks wind and rain. A historian may see it as a source of barriers to migration or invasion. And the Indians of the Northwest, by the way, looked at this specific mountain as God. Thinking about it for a moment, each of these interpretations may be correct. But which one adequately explains a mountain? Because a mountain is so many different things to so many different people. The answer has to be that no one view by itself provides a complete explanation for mountain. Taken all together, however, they provide a background for understanding mountains and the mountain concept. Now, the same thing can be said for practically every human experience. We have explained ourselves and our world in terms of our knowledge and interests, and each may be satisfied with his or her interpretation primarily because it's one conditioned by our personal knowledge and experience. Second slide, please. Arguments frequently ensue as to who possesses the truth, and wars have been fought about interpretations of theology, geography, history, or economics. These are just headlines from newspapers indicating controversy after controversy. No one discipline possesses all the truth, but each possesses some. No one discipline is completely wrong in its interpretation of the human condition, but it is certainly not exclusively right either. Now, difficulties arise when one of the epistemic positions is posited as an explanation for all, as if, for example, the Indians of the Northwest were to demand that whenever a mountain was mentioned, in whatever context, it must be noted as God, or the poet to insist that the geologist use the terminology granite of purpled mountain majesty. This situation is essentially what we are confronted with tonight, an attempt to superimpose on science requirements derived from outside the discipline. The so-called scientific creationism is a lineal descendant of the anti-evolution stance of fundamentalists at the beginning of this century. Let's look at the next slide. Anti-evolution has never proven very popular, but has nonetheless been subtly successful. So much so that by the 1950s, the best-selling high school biology book in the United States nowhere included the word evolution. The post-Sputnik upheaval in science education reintroduced the term, and the anti-evolutionists once again had a flag around which to rally. Now, we'll just go to the next slide, which is perfectly blank. It's a little bit underexposed, but it is in perfect focus. So just leave that on or turn it off because it's just a spacer. Having been unsuccessful in banning evolution, they resorted to an old truism: if you can't lick 'em, join 'em. And so-called scientific creationism was born as a creature of the 1960s, asking only for fair play and equal time for what was described as an alternative scientific explanation. The appeal is subtle and clever. I don't know that anyone in this room, including myself, is against fair play or equal time for equally valid explanations. However, the equal time concept can be carried to extreme. No one proposes, for example, that after a quarter of football, one should play an inning of baseball to provide equal time for alternative sports. One does not suggest that after an allopathic presentation in medical schools that one should devote equal time to the healing power of witchcraft. Christian scientists have not suggested that every time the germ theory of disease is mentioned in a health class, it should be accompanied by comparable readings from Science and Health. In short, there are limits to our concepts of equal time and what constitutes fair play. Tonight, we are supposedly assembled for a presentation of alternative explanations of origins and diversity. But after 20 years of reading and attentive listening to the written and spoken words of creationists, their own position is still not clear. And Mr. Gish made it no clearer this evening. At various times, they have told me that the Earth is 10,000 years old, that dinosaurs and human beings coexisted on Earth much in the same fashion as in the comic strip Alley-Oop, that the Noachian flood occurred about 6000 BC, formed the Grand Canyon in a single year, moved continents, formed mountain ranges, and laid down all the layers of the geologic column complete with fossils. All living organisms today are descendants from those who boarded the Ark for its voyage. Now, if I have misinterpreted or misrepresented the position of creation scientists, I'm sure that Dr. Gish can clarify that position. In contrast, science says that the Earth is 4 billion years old, a serious number of orders of magnitude greater than that admitted by creationists. Science has no evidence to support a worldwide Noachian flood, nor the abrupt creation of continents, mountains, or the Grand Canyon. The geologic column was laid down over millions of years with ordered ranks of fossils whose representation is so vast that in order to hold two members of each fossil species that ever lived on Earth, a string of railroad cars stretching from New York to Los Angeles would be insufficient to hold them. A small part of the scientific picture of the age of the Earth and the physical processes by which it came to its present state is involved with the theory of evolution, which is perhaps the most misunderstood of scientific theories in the lay mind, primarily as a result of willful misrepresentation. For example, if you understand that the theory of evolution states that man descended from apes, you're wrong. If you feel that evolution is announced as a mechanistic striving for perfection, you're wrong. If you know that evolution is taught in American schools as fact, you're wrong. If you've been told that those who subscribe to evolution are atheists, you've been wrongly informed. But we get nowhere discussing what evolution isn't. Simply put, evolution makes three simple statements. One, organisms have changed over time, a fact that even a cursory visit to a natural history museum will support, as some of Dr. Gish's slides did this evening. That organisms are related one to another, a statement substantiated by studies of biochemistry, genetics, morphology, and physiology. The fact that we can do experiments on guinea pigs and rats and mice and have them applicable to humans must mean some commonality of structure and function. And the third point is that natural processes select those organisms best fitted for a given environment, which is why you find polar bears at the North Pole and penguins at the South Pole. Now, these three statements are not very difficult of comprehension, and adequate evidence exists to support each. Most of the rest of what you hear about evolution is either amplification or misrepresentation of those three basic statements. Let's have the next slide. Creationists have resorted to a simple trick of reductionism by stating that there are only two different explanations for the origin of the universe and the living things it contains. Dr. Gish pointed that out this evening. Once you buy this dichotomy, which creationists speak of as the two-model approach, and of which they are so enamored that they wish to reduce all the world's information on history, politics, economics, and every conceivable subject to a two-model framework, you have been had. For the two-model approach, while an appealingly simplistic one, abdicates to those making the dichotomy what the two selections will be. In this case, it is the theory of evolution versus scientific creationism. And the next slide will show the materials that are directed to a teacher concerning this particular two-model dichotomy. The appeal for fair play to include the two models in our public schools reduces to an appeal to reject a vast number of alternatives. It was the communists during World War II who presented a two-model approach, which was, if you were to reject Nazism, the only alternative that one could accept wholeheartedly was communism. So there are other chances and choices. Dr. Gish mentioned this evening Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe, and he indicated that the dichotomy was that there must be a God versus, of course, atheism. Now, what he forgot to mention in terms of both Hoyle and Wickramasinghe, they don't even believe life originated on this planet. It came from outer space and seeded this planet. But there's no room for that in the two-model approach. Let's go to the next spacer there. There have been, over the centuries, a wide variety of accounts both of origins and organismic diversity, which the two-model approach ignores. There's no place to mention the cosmozoic theory, which postulates that life did not originate on Earth at all, but was seeded through space from other galactic sources. See Mr. Hoyle and Wickramasinghe. Nor, on the creationist side, is any credence to be given to the existence of the creation accounts of the American Indian, the Hindu, or even the interpretations of other Protestant faiths. Mr. Gish recalled that Wickramasinghe was an atheist. I always thought he was a Buddhist. It's an either-or, take it or leave it phenomenon. But the fallout is a perfect delight to a debater, because once you accept that there are two and only two explanations, then anything that tends to disprove one automatically supports the other, simply because there's no other choice. This explains why creationists spend practically all of their time looking for chinks in the armor of evolution, rather than for data that supports their own position. It's a case of trying to make the other fellow look bad so that you look good. And the research at the Institute for Creation Research consists primarily of looking through the writings of scientists and selecting, as you saw this evening, sentences or paragraphs that can be twisted to seem to say that these scientists have abandoned evolution or support scientific creationism. Creationists are led to the occasionally ludicrous situation of citing supposed supporters of scientific creationism who died long before the dogma was developed to its present state. Some of those names were brought forth this evening. It is to the advantage of creationists to give the impression that evolution is a dying theory being abandoned by the scientific community and on highly shaky ground. Nothing could be further from the truth. Can we see the next slide? In his book, The Origin of Species, Darwin was able to consider, that's a very dim Darwin, he's a young man there, I guess he's a little fuzzy at that time. In his book, The Origin of Species, Darwin was able to consider evidences primarily from hybridization, the geologic record, geographic distribution, morphology, embryology, and vestigial organs. From these rather limited databases, he constructed his theory of natural selection to explain organismic diversity and relationship. The theory of evolution, more than any other scientific theory, has stood the test of time, and it is unique in that every scientific field developed subsequently to Darwin's time has added to the theory. Darwin knew nothing about genetics and proposed an ill-fated theory of pangenesis to account for inheritance. Next slide. But the work of Mendel and the geneticists at the beginning of the 20th century elucidated the mechanism of inheritance and added further support to the theory of evolution. I hope you can see these better than I can, because that is a slide that's designed to show you how different channels of scientific investigation worked out the chromosome theory of inheritance. Now, biochemistry, molecular biology, and a host of other fields unknown at Darwin's time have supported, not discredited, the theory of evolution. And indeed, evolution stands taller and stronger in the 1980s than it ever did in the 1880s. And this is not as a result of a supine, docile acceptance of evolution by biological scientists, as Dr. Gish would have you believe, but rather because it has been put to every conceivable test which it has weathered with flying colors. Now, there isn't a biological scientist today who wouldn't give his eye teeth to do to Darwin what Einstein did to Newton. and to achieve that measure of earthly immortality that comes with having one's name associated with a major theoretical concept. It might be noted, by the way, in speaking of Einstein and Newton, that it never occurred to Einstein that he should ask for equal time in America's classrooms for relativity whenever Newtonian mechanics was discussed. Nor would he have found it of much value to be debating scientific issues before a lay audience in a church. He knew that scientific issues were settled in the laboratory and in the field and communicated through publications that make the data available to others for verification. The public, by and large, is in no position to adjudicate scientific issues. Next slide, which, contrary to the desires of the head of the Institute for Creation Research, cannot be decided either by applause or vote. Is there another? All right. You can't see the bottom of this. Let me just tell you. Okay, Williams, we vote. How many here say the heart has 4 chambers? You can't do that in science. It is what it is. You don't vote on it. Let's have the next slide in this sequence. I want to give you an example of some voting. This appeared in newspapers some time back. The Reverend Falwell was conducting a poll, and he says, do you agree with the theories of evolution that deny the biblical account of creation? Now, this is very similar to when did you stop beating your wife? First of all, what are the theories of evolution, and which ones deny the biblical account of creation? That's not explained. The second question, do you agree that public school teachers should be permitted to teach our children as fact that they descended from apes? I don't know a single public school teacher that teaches that. And lastly, do you agree with the evolutionists who are attempting to prevent the biblical account of creation from being taught in public schools? I don't know anybody who's done that either. What they have said is, and I'll come to this a little later, it's not good science. But to get back to evolution, if Darwin had never existed and the origin of species never written, the discoveries of the 20th century, and particularly those since about 1920, would have led again to the theory of evolution. It might not have been called evolution, but the work of geneticists certainly would have developed the concept of organismic change through time, if we can have the next slide, relatedness of organisms, and adaptation to environment, which we are now discovering operates at a cellular and molecular level. This is Jim Watson, the DNA man. If it weren't for Darwin being first, Watson might have been first. The next slide will show Joshua Lederberg, another man who might be credited with a 20th century evolutionary theory, based on different data than Darwin, but coming to the same conclusions. Make no mistake about it, the evidence for evolution mounts in ever-increasing numbers, and one should not confuse the scientific arguments about mechanism with dissatisfaction with the process. We could turn on the next blank there to clear the screen. Creationists frequently cite the work of Gould and Eldridge and Goldschmidt and others as if these individuals were denying evolution. Now, I took my genetics under Goldschmidt at Berkeley, and I know both Gould and Eldridge very well, and I can assure you that nothing in their work denigrates the theory of evolution. Although they may have disagreed with the way in which it may have happened, This does not make them closet creationists. I'm quite willing to fall knowingly into the trap of the two-model approach and pretend that it has validity in order to avail myself of the same techniques as used by Dr. Gish, who's on the road most of the year making presentations to lay audiences in churches and schools. Although Dr. Gish has not seen fit to discuss the creation model, there must be something within it that has caused it uniformly to be rejected within the field of science. Basically, creationist scientific explanations have been rejected because they're scientifically unsound, based on misdirection or misconception, and obviously designed to buttress a foreordained conclusion, which is the exact opposite of the way science operates. It's as if you read the end of the mystery, found out that the butler did it, and then went back and provided evidence for him to do so. Now, we won't have time to go in detail through the next 3 slides, but let's very quickly take a look at these, which deal with the processes of hypothesis formation. We can show this one, and then the next one, and then the third one. These 3 go right together. Scientists follow where the data lead. They discard hypotheses that are unsupported, regardless of how attractive an idea may be. If it's not supported by the evidence, it must be discarded. Now, Dr. Gish this evening cited Piltdown Man and Nebraska Man and a few others, but he didn't tell you that the people who found out those were frauds were scientists, not creationists. Scientists is a self-correcting device. Its conclusions are always under review, and when found faulty, are exposed. Science is constantly changing, and there's no scientist who would not discard the theory of evolution if available data supported an alternative thesis. Let's look at the next slide for just a moment. You already looked at it, but I wasn't looking. That's it. What this says down at the bottom, and I'm sorry that these slides are bigger than the screen, it says it's a shame that everything we know today is going to be changed in the future. And I think that's as good a way of explicating how science operates as anything I know. Let's go on to the next blank. Creationists, on the other hand, allow nothing to challenge their position. I've asked creationists in the past what evidence they would accept as disproving their position, and the answer has always been the same: none. A position that evidence can neither attack nor influence is not scientific. Every major scientific and educational organization in the United States is on record as opposing teaching of creationism as science in public schools. Now remember that, that's important. Teaching creationism as science, not as teaching creationism as creationism. On the other hand, as religion is an important part of American life, there's been considerable support for courses in comparative religion, which I have suggested everywhere I go. No one is sanguine enough to believe that such a course would remove religious intolerance, but it might be helpful if students understood what the people in the church with the dome believe in relation to what the people in the church with the steeple believe. Now, strangely enough, some of the best resistance to this idea has come from the creationists themselves, and Dr. Gish, I suppose, can explain why he does not favor comparative religion courses in schools. It's apparent that anti-evolutionists have elected to place their views exclusively in science classrooms rather than to pit them against other theological beliefs. Thus, electing the road of science, they must be subject to the same principles and processes, the same methodology and critical review and the same necessity for clear elucidation in support of their system as applied to all science. Now, for the sake of argument, let's assume that scientific creationism is, as its proponents suggest, a scientific alternative to the theory of evolution, and see how it stands elementary testing. Next slide, please. A major tenet of scientific creationism is of a young Earth. And here are ages worked out by Morris and Barnes and Kofall and Gentry and Slusher, etc., creationists working on this problem. The creation explanation is unequivocal on this point, placing creation about 10,000 BC and the flood about 6,000 BC. Now, this is a remarkable statement, not because of the absence of evidence for a young Earth, but because it demands ignoring the huge amount of evidence for an old Earth. Cosmologists, biologists, geologists, paleontologists, and indeed every scientific discipline that has dealt with the problem of age has independently come up with a wide variety of data to support an Earth age orders of magnitude away from the creationist figure. It was the darling of the creationists whom Gish mentioned, Lord Kelvin, who set out to prove a young age of the Earth. He started with that premise. But it was his own experiments and observations that ended up dating it between 20 and 400 million years of age, a figure far in excess of these claims. Now, our dating techniques have now become so much more sophisticated than those in the time of Kelvin that it's incredible that anyone today can seriously suggest a young Earth. Anti-evolutionists claim, however, because scientific data refutes their position, that the scientists are wrong. To this end, they either inadvertently or deliberately cite out of context and misrepresent data. Let's have the next slide, please. This is some data from a creationist by the name of Wood-Merapi. He listed more than 300 supposed anomalous radiometric ages that he culled from the scientific literature, and claims these examples cast serious doubt on the validity of radiometric dating. Now, one of the things creationists count on is the fact that readers, for the most part, do not go back to the original data cited in a paper, but rather take the statements at face value. This can lead to the acceptance of spurious conclusions. Now, I happen to go back to look at the data cited by Wood-Merapi. He gives an expected age in this particular chart of 140 million years for the Coast Range batholith of Alaska. Now, careful reading of the paper cited for that data shows that the potassium-argon ages of 163 to 186 million years were from another paper. The age obtained were from another paper and obtained from samples contained and collected in Canada, not Alaska. Now, there's nothing wrong with these ages. They're consistent with the known geologic relationships and represent the crystallization of the Canadian samples. Now, where Wood-Merapi obtained the 140 million year expected age is anyone's guess, because it doesn't appear in the paper he cites. So, by the use of Canadian data for an Alaskan sample, and referring to data that does not appear in the cited paper, Wood-Merapi's presentation must be viewed, most kindly put, with skepticism. Creation scientists commonly claim that the process of radioactive decay is not constant, and that the decay constants are not well known. Let's look at the next slide, because this is a meritless claim. Here are a number of principal, parent, and daughter isotopes used in radiometric dating, and they're used to check on one another. There have been no significant changes observed in the decay constants of those isotopes used for dating, and the changes induced in the decay rates of other radioactive isotopes are very small. Inaccuracies in radiometric dating due to changes in decay rates could, at the very most, be but a few percent. As to the accuracy of constants, let's look at the next slide. The proposition and calculations of creationist Cook, which should show up in a minute. There it is. These are taken from Cook. The scientific age in the literature was 622 million years. Cook's calculations bring it down to 70 million years. But because Cook's work was based on data that do not exist, extrapolated to fatally flawed state by demonstrably false assumptions, when you do Cook's calculations correctly with Cook's numbers, you get 644 million years. Now, next slide. Among the so-called evidences cited by creationists for a young Earth is the decay of the Earth's magnetic field. And this is a drawing taken from one of these papers that deal with the magnetic flux. Here again, the calculations and conclusions are flawed by false initial assumptions and overly simplified view of the magnetic field behavior. We know, for example, that the Earth reverses polarity, so that the North Pole becomes the South Pole and the South Pole becomes the North Pole, and vice versa. But creationists deny that the Earth's field is reversed. The field also changes in intensity or strength. It's changing right now, but not in the way creationists claim. The simplest way I can explain this is that the Earth can't be dated by its magnetic field. Creationist calculations concerning the Earth's magnetic age are meaningless, but continue to be reiterated, as in the most recent paper by Barnes in the Institute for Creation Research Impact for August of 1983. Another creationist contention is to support a young Earth by the influx of meteoric dust. Creationists argue that the age of the Earth cannot be great because if it were, there'd be a layer of meteoric dust 185 feet deep on both the Earth and the Moon. Next slide. But they fail to take into account evidence that shows the mass of meteoric material impinging on the Earth is only about 22,000 tons a year. Now, the creationist calculations are at the top and the scientific data at the bottom. And what they say simply is this: the amount of meteoric dust is going to form a layer about 8.1 centimeters thick in 4.55 billion years. Thus, Morris, who made some of these creationist calculations, is off by a factor of more than 600. When one considers the fact that good satellite data on meteoric influx were available, showing only 10 centimeters on the Moon before either Morris or Schleicher published their papers, it's evident that they have been highly selective in their choice of obsolete data. A more fundamental point, however, is that such calculations are based on a faulty premise. Let's go on to the next blank. That the age of the Earth is measured in billions of years is beyond question, and it is supported by a great variety of independently derived scientific data. Radiometric dating has independently confirmed and quantified the geologic timescale, which was originally constructed on the basis of stratigraphic and faunal succession before the development of modern isotopic dating techniques. While radiometric dating has allowed scientists more accurately to assign ages and to establish the length of the various eras, periods, and epochs, the relative order of these geologic time units has remained unchanged. This is powerful proof that both the dating technique and the paleontological and stratigraphic principles on which the time scale was based are sound. There are more than 100,000 radiometric ages in the scientific literature that date rock formations and geologic events ranging in age from recent to earliest Precambrian. These data and all of the accumulated knowledge from the science of geology show conclusively that the Earth as we see it is the result of natural processes operating over vast periods of time, and not the product of a few catastrophic events operating in the last 10,000 years, as held by scientific creationists. Next slide, please. Creationists have stated that humans and dinosaurs were contemporaries in time. This is the alley-oop syndrome I mentioned at the beginning. Now, this statement is based on the fraudulent Paluxy River tracks. These are to be found in Texas and are interpreted by anti-evolutionists as human footprints side by side with those of dinosaurs. Were this momentous statement true, the names of its discoverers would thunder down the corridors of time as individuals who made one of the most outstanding discoveries of the 20th century. Unfortunately, the Paluxy River tracks are frauds, and what's more, the anti-evolutionists know that they are. Don't take my word for it. Don't take the word of every reputable paleontologist who's examined the tracks. Don't take the word of any scientist. But perhaps you would take the word of some creationists themselves. At Loma Linda University in California, the Geoscience Institute, which is run by Seventh-day Adventists, publishes a journal called Origins, designed to promote creationist causes. In their publication, Volume 2, Number 2, for 1975, there's an article entitled Dinosaur Tracks and Giant Men, which deals with the Glen Rose region of central Texas, which is where the Paluxy River is located. Now, a few quotes from this publication dealing with the Paluxy tracks may help to set the record straight. One is, quote, "The most likely possibility is that these tracks are of reptilian origin," unquote. A second quote, "In my opinion, these footprints are not tracks at all, but represent random erosion marks in the surface of the limestone plate." Still another quote, "In each instance, the rock layers end abruptly at the edge of the track, indicating that they are not the result of a foot stepping into soft mud, but are produced by carving." Local old-timers of the Paluxy River area tell that the tracks were both excavated and carved as a source of income during the Depression years, unquote. And the last statement is, and I quote again, "The Glen Rose region of the Paluxy River does not provide good evidence for the past existence of giant men, nor does it provide evidence for coexistence of such men or other large mammals and the giant dinosaurs," unquote. Now that, my friends, is one creationist talking to another. Having seen representations of these so-called tracks, I can tell you, first of all, it takes a great deal of imagination to believe that they're footprints at all. And secondly, that they seem to be evolving in place. At one time, the creationists were asked why the footprints had no toes, and the response was that the feet were obviously shod. It was interesting, however, to note that in a couple of years, the footprints did have toes. Now, the fact that toes evolved so rapidly in the Paluxy River region may be a greater scientific discovery than the contemporaneous nature of human and dinosaur footprints. Now, the surface of the Earth and all of its features, mountains, canyons, rivers, and plains, are explained by anti-evolutionists by evoking flood geology to account for the fossil record in the geologic column. Let's have the next slide. You missed one. That's it. Here you have the creationist view on the right and the evolutionary view on the left. Geologic time way off to the left. What you're seeing here is an indication that flood geology accounts for the fossil record and the geologic column. Like pulling a plug on a bathtub, the waters which supposedly covered the entire surface of the earth disappeared into some unknown recess, leaving behind sediments containing remains of animals that scientists view as a record of life over millions of years. The anti-evolutionists, however, contend that all of these organisms were contemporaneous in time and became deceased at the same time. Now, if this were so, one would expect the fossil record to be mixed. Next slide. If all of these organisms existed at the same time and they all died at the same time, we should find mammals and birds and reptiles and amphibians in bottom layers as well as top layers. We should find dinosaurs near the top and dinosaurs near the bottom, but we don't. The further back in the rock record we go, the simpler the organisms become. There are no mammals or birds or vertebrates of any kind in the lower rock layers. They appear much later. Think about it a moment. The sorting out of organisms in a liquid medium should be by gravity. In other words, the biggest and heaviest should be on the bottom and the smallest and lightest on the top, which, of course, is exactly the opposite of what is found. The smaller, lighter, simpler things are on the bottom, and the bigger, heavier, more complex things near the top. The creationist explanation for this is that these larger organisms climbed away from the water and thus were the last to perish in a rising flood tide, and therefore obviously are near the top. But how do they explain the plants, which were certainly not mobile enough to climb to higher reaches? Plant phylogeny extends from the simple algal-like organisms on the bottom to the large flowering plants near the top. The fossil record supports evolution, not creationism. And the contortions that anti-evolution